My name is John Adam Ciburk. I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, in a rooming house, not in the hospital, in a rooming house, on July the 30th, 1928. When the Depression started, we moved to Harrison, New Jersey, which was my mother's hometown. And I started school there in Public School 5 with Mrs. Nugent, the only teacher that I remember. But Mrs. Nugent was my first grade teacher. I'm Lithuanian. My father came from Lithuanian. He was a draft dodger. His family had money, and they were able to send him to the United States before he got drafted by the Russians, because the Russians would have puts all of those people up in the front line. And my mother was born in England, where my grandmother and grandfather, grandmother is Machuta in Lithuania, had lived and had 2 kids born on their way to the United States. About 1935-36, we came back to St. Louis and lived all over the place. My father, as I say, has a college degree, but he couldn't get jobs. He worked in WPA. My mother, from the time she was 13, she had never gone to high school. She worked in a dress factory in Newark, New Jersey. So she walked across the Passaic River every day to go to work. And she worked that field all her life. And then anyway, I graduated from St. Peter and Paul grade school in St. Louis. I started Roosevelt High School, and after a while I dropped out and started work. I had no problems working during the war. You could walk into any place, and 14, 15, it didn't make any difference. They were so short of bodies that I could go to work at Shapley or at United Wood Heel. They made wood heels for women's shoes. And as I say, up until 46, it just got to be so difficult. It was just impossible to find work, because if there was a job available, they would go to this GI who was coming home. And when the war was over, probably 40% of the population in the country were unemployed, because what you did is there was so much war production going. The automobile places that were making Jeeps stopped. You know, the Army didn't need 500,000 more Jeeps, so they stopped. They didn't need tanks. They didn't need guns. They didn't need the clothes. You had 5 million men coming back. I couldn't find a job. I said, well, I'll join the Merchant Marine. I went down in St. Louis to their office, and they said, oh, we don't take people with glasses. I walked down the street, walked in to the Army, and said, I want to join the Army. And they said, how long? Because at that time you could join for 1.5 years, for 3 years, for 4 years. I said, well, I'll take 1.5 years. I mean, you know, they've sent me in a back room. They had someone listen to my heart, take my blood pressure, and they said, oh, he's okay. And I came out, and there were 4 or 5 other young men there. I was 17. And raise your right hand, take the oath, come back here tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. And we did, and they took us on a bus down to Jefferson Barracks. And that's the way I joined the Army. Went to Fort Leavenworth, and in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, I went to prison because they put the signed 4 of us to go over and pick up sheets. And the sheets were done at Fort Leavenworth Prison. And I think what they ought to do, and this was the prison for Army, Navy, people who had committed crimes. And I think everybody ought to go to prison because it makes you think that you better be good because you don't want to come back here. And a reason why I went into the Army Air Corps, I don't know, except they said, what is one of the questions, what's your hobby? And I said, making model airplanes. So they sent me to the Army Air Corps down Lackland Air Force Base, Lackland Army Air Base in San Antonio to go through basic training. From basic, I was supposed to go to the South Pacific. They redlined me because I needed dental work. Now, I had only enlisted, this is May, June, July, August, September. They sent me to Denver to go to clerk typist school. And they wouldn't put me in clerk typist school because they say, he's only got 12, 13 months, and he won't have any time to be able to do any work for the Army after he gets through with training. So then they sent me down to to Fort Worth, Texas, on-the-job training as a mechanic on B-29s. I stayed there for probably around 8 months. But in that 8-month period of time, we went to Germany. And going into Germany, before they came over Paris, the group that were flying separately got together and flew in formation. And we flew over the Eiffel Tower at 1,000 feet over the Eiffel Tower. I saw the Eiffel Tower from 1,000 feet looking down on it. And then coming back, after we came back, what they did, the bases, the 29 was had a big tail. And most of the the hangars were not that high. The ones in Fort Worth weren't. So when you were going to work on a plane and you pulled it into a hangar and they closed the doors, there was a wide space that the cold air would come in. Spokane had been set up as a B-29, established for B-29s. You could pull a B-29 into the hangar and close the doors. And that's why they opened it up again. Went up there, nice town, cold, cold, cold. Cold in the winter, nice in the summer. In the summer, they just stayed there in the wintertime. In the summer, they would send you to places like Anchorage, Alaska, Newfoundland, so you couldn't enjoy the weather that was there.
So where were you when the war actually started, when the Korean War started?
When Korea started, I was at Spokane, because I got up there and stayed there. That's when I got up there in 47, 48. We went to Okinawa, and it was after we came back from Okinawa in 48. It was December of 48 that he came in and said, "Who wants to go to flight engineer school?" So I started flight engineer school in 49. It ran Tool. It was a 6-month school. It was, there were three, it basically worked down, there were 3 months involved in engines, plane body, and electrical systems, all the systems on the plane. And then you went into actually learning how to fly cruise control. To fly cruise control, there were, depending upon the altitude that you were at, because that was your first basic thing, that how much gas do you have to use to fly at these altitudes. And what they did is they had established things for 5,000, 10,000, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35,000. That was the max. But then if you were flying at 18,000, you had to go through a formula in order to figure these out. And it was a good school. When I got out of flight engineer school, this was around June, July, somewhere there. And I went back to Spokane. Our group was over in England. This was in '48. And naturally, they didn't give me my records to carry. They sent them separately, and I didn't have them. So you can't go to England before you have your shots. I had shots, but they didn't have any records. So they gave me 13 shots that night, one of which was tetanus. Tetanus always gave me 105 fever. And I wake up the next morning feeling better, get the stuff and go out and get on a 29. And we took off for England. And we get to England. The service, I was a buck sergeant, 3 stripes sergeant. But they were so many top three graders that everybody, buck sergeant and below, had to pull KP. So we get to England, and they start putting me on KP. Now, I had been pulled KP, as I say, in Spokane. But what they did is every time they put me on KP, I was flying. There was the one time it was advantageous to fly. And they still, none of the 5 of us could fly back by themselves because they felt we still needed more training. But England was cold. We were there in August. And we went over to Great Yarmouth, which is a resort on the east coast of England. And we were wearing winter ODs, maybe not overcoats, but we had winter clothes on. And then we came back, and we flew, and we flew, and we flew. And you could go through stages. Sometimes you might go through a bad stage where you go out to fly for 10 times and you can't take off. Something happened. Or you go out for 10, 15 times and nothing happens. And it was but then when Korea started, the whole thing changed. It was no longer, no, this is funny and that's funny and that's funny. It's because when they always flew out of Yokota at 4, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. No, take it back. 7, 8 o'clock. But I had to be out there at 5 o'clock checking the plane. And there are other funny things. We have, real quick, the type of outfit it was. The 343rd Bomb Squadron, older people, some older people. Jughead Jarvis was a master sergeant. At this time, was a master sergeant. a top sergeant had a little triangle, double triangle in the middle of his stripes. Jughead Jarvis carried, in one of his shirts, had the triangle. Because what would happen is about every 4 or 5 months, the top sergeant would say, I got to get out of this outfit. This is crazy. And they kick him out. He applied someplace else. He get transferred. Jughead put his shirt on. And we got finally a top sergeant in who was from the beginning of the Second World War. And he was an old Army man. And he was tough. And he was going to straighten this outfit out. And we started 6 o'clock, you get fall out for reveille. 6 o'clock, reveille. Everybody's falling out, falling out, falling out.
What does falling out mean?
Coming out of the barracks and lining up in front. And so I can't think of his name. I wish I could. Anyway, 6 o'clock, we're out there. And he's not there one day. 6:01 comes. 6:02 comes. And Jughead Jarvis gets up, dismissed! And we're going away when he's coming out to inspect the troops. He lasted 2 more months. He applied to be, he applied and went to become an electrician.
And where were you stationed again during the war?
Yokota Air Force Base, which is in Japan. It's probably 30 miles from Tokyo. And we had the base. Understanding at this time America was running Japan. I have a lot that I dislike about General Douglas MacArthur. I think he did great in the Second World War, and he got up into Korea. He did great at Incheon. But the one thing that I think he did right is he didn't like to wear a tie in the summertime, and you didn't have to wear a tie in the summertime. And therefore, you could walk around all of Japan wearing khakis with no ties, and I loved it. Because I never did like wearing ties. And I had to do it in the winter, and in the summer it was a waste. But anyway, the first mission was to bomb the oil refinery on the east coast of North Korea. And that was done. That was the thing when we left it. It was blazing and it was smoke going up. And from what I could see, it was destroyed. After that, what we started into was to go by Army missions. In the past, you had the Air Force had done a lot of military destroying cities. North Korea didn't have that much city type. They didn't want to hit Pyongyang. They never hit Pyongyang. So we started, as we were hitting roads, we were trying to hit bridges, anything like that would stop the Army. Because the Army, we were getting the hell kicked out of us in the ground. In June, we were going down to Busan. In a month, 2 months, South Korea was almost conquered. Seoul was gone. All the cities were gone. So all you could do is try to stop what the Army was moving and bomb bridges, bomb roads, try to bomb the Yala bridges, which are, as I say, was a fiasco because you can't bomb a bridge that's over here when you're over here. And maybe if you're lucky and the bombs go right, but it's luck, and it never got lucky. When the Chinese came in, then that was at a point in time when we started to bomb villages. And the reason we bombed the village is the village had housing for the Chinese. So we started it into a housing campaign, bombing houses. And it was, I think about that, and even now I don't like it. But at that time, I never worried about it. I never decided that what I was doing was wrong. I was never just wrong on anything. And what they said, we're going to go do this, we went and did it. And, but the bridges and roads, bridges were another thing, because that's the more bridges that you could destroy, the better off you would be trying to stop them coming in. We never bombed South Korea. We never bombed South Korea. We never bombed anything in South Korea. The fighter bombers could do that, but we went north. We went north and stayed north. And whatever it was, it was not like you're trying to destroy the manufacturing goods of like they did on Germany or Japan in the Second World War. You were more supportive of the army on the ground than you were in the air, and which in that case is because they didn't have that much. I don't know. There were two stages like that came in. When we got there, we were bombing military objects. When the Chinese came in, but this time the Army had been well north of the 39th parallel. When the Chinese came in, one of the things we tried to bomb were the Yellow River bridges. It was a fiasco. We were using World War II bombs. We had no guided bombs. You were also at a position where the bridge would be here, and you're over here trying to bomb these bridges because over here was China. So you didn't want to, if you went over China, you were subject to really being shot down. Also, China was not at war with us, even though it had an army of 250,000 men down there. We never hit the bridge. If you came within 50 yards of the bridge, it was a good thing. And Korea was for when you flew over Korea and you could look down at Korea. Korea was mountainous. After the Chinese came in, it started cold, and this is not a matter of disrespect. I would look down and I say, "Oh, those poor bastards," and I say the poor bastards. It was a matter of love because it was so bad. I went home and ate. A lot of them on the ground couldn't eat, except it came out of a can. I had the Chinese came in. I flew one night mission. It was a leaflet mission. It was funny to a certain extent. The leaflet said, "Surrender, surrender, surrender." And we dropped the leaflets, and we're going south, and all you saw was the American Army lights going south. It's because I think it was a wasted raid, you know, but that's what happened. I flew 43 missions, every one of them with 20,000 pounds of bombs. 2 missions we took off to fly. One of them, we were loaded, going down the runway, and a bomb door flew open. Fortunately, the bombardier was able to close it in order for us to get off the ground. It fell open again. He was not able to close it. We got up to about 3,000 feet. We flew out over the Japanese Sea. The bomb door kept flying open. We dropped our bombs in the Japanese Sea and flew back. When we got back, we found that there was a hole in the bomb door, and it looked a round hole. It looked like somebody shot at us. And as they kept inspecting and looking, what they found was there had been a spark plug that had got on the runway, had been picked up by the prop, had been thrown into the bomb bay door straight like it was, so it made a round hole, hit one of the lines that kept the kept the bomb doors closed, and hit it, and that's why it flew open. And crazy. The other mission that we were going to go, we took off, got up, it was a cloudy day, and got up to 7,000 feet, and number 2 caught on fire. And I pulled the fire extinguishers, and nothing. It tried, we shut down the engine, and the prop was still going and was still burning. About that time, number 3 caught on fire. We had 2 engines on fire. We couldn't maintain altitude. We were in a dense fog. It's a reddish type of fog. And we were in mountains that were going about 7,000 feet, and we were losing altitude, and we couldn't see, and we had to jump. And so fortunately, there was an 11-man crew on a 29, and of the 11 men, we all landed safely. One radio operator broke his leg. Got back to Yokota after 2 days because he had to take a train to go north, and then they flew us back. But a month later, I'm sitting there eating breakfast, and I get up and I fall flat in my face with the pain. The reason I mention this is not because of the pain so much, except that I went to see the flight surgeon. I was scheduled to fly the next day. And you got to climb on a 29. When you're pre-flight, you climb all over. You climb to look from the bottom, and you get up and walk the wings. And I'm bent over like this when we landed. And I was, I'm a young man. Your body takes a lot when you're young. And it was just that it finally caught up with me. But I go to see the flight surgeon. He said, "Oh, you can fly." And I said, "How could I fly? I'm really like that, just bent over." And he said, "Oh, okay, I'll ground you for this flight. Here's some aspirin." It came out okay. The B-29 was a good airplane. At that point in time, it was no longer the modern type of airplane that it was 5 years ago. It was I had 43 missions in, and my father, who was living in Houston, Texas, my father and mother were divorced. Was dying. So they said, "Do you want to go home and see him, or do you want to stay?" I said, "I'd like to stay, but I better go home and see him." And so that's what happened. I went back, saw him. After I went back to Spokane, there was no planes to fly. They sent me to March Field in California, Riverside. And from there, they sent us to open a base at Lake Charles, Louisiana. And I went there. I was a staff sergeant. I was a buck sergeant when I got out of my first discharge from the Army, and then became a member of the Air Force, and I never knew when. But anyway, so he went to Lake Charles, and I went up before a board. First time I ever did it to go for tech sergeant. I'd go into the board, and they ask me questions about my experience, etc. And I say, well, you know, I do this. And they say, do you drink? And I say, yeah, I did at the time. I haven't had a drink now for 25 years. But they say, well, what if you had overdrank, or what if you were drunk and you were supposed to fly? I said, I fly. And they didn't make me a tech sergeant. However, they were short of tech sergeant, flight engineers. So I went before another board the next month, and they didn't ask me the question. They made me a tech sergeant, and I still got out 3 months later. And another thing that's just from that bailing out. As I said, I put my gun belt and my escape app thing behind the seat, and I left it there when I jumped. After this, they did the inspections, as they will do. I had to write a report on what I remembered about everything before we bailed out, and I did it. I did one report for the airplane. I did 4 reports on what happened to the $10 gold piece. Really, I had to write 4 times what happened to the $10 gold piece. So, Korea was. We were young. We were basically young. Although there were Second World War men. The best friend I had, Fred Ciburk, was my center fire control gunner on the 29. We bailed out together. And but even Fred at that time was in his mid-20s. But we were young. The big thing is you can go outside here and you'll see the Air Force uniforms. I never received an Air Force uniform. I got out in '51, which was approximately 4 years after the Air Force started. Nobody in our group ever received an Air Force uniform, including the officers. Now, I don't know where they were putting them, but they were putting them someplace.
So you were still being issued that, was it part of the Army before it was specifically Air Force?
Yeah. When I was discharged, my uniform I wore home was an Army uniform with Air Force stripes on. But that was it. They were behind times. After this, Warren, when he went in, was in '47. I think he said he got an Air Force Blues. But the ones where they transferred groups over from the Army to the Air Force, you keep wearing Air Force, I keep wearing Army. I have a picture that was made, the only one ever was made for me, in 1950 up at Spokane, where the flight crew and the ground crew are standing or kneeling to get their, it's like a Christmas picture, it was. nobody's wearing anything that's blue. And Fred Ciburk and I were the only ones that had Air Force stripes on. Everybody else was wearing Army stripes.
So a second ago, when you were saying you and Fred bailed out, are you talking about the time when the engines were on fire?
When the two engines caught on fire. When you're flying with 4 engines, your weight was about a max weight, including 20,000 pounds of bombs, which we always flew with, were 120,000 pounds. That's with 4 engines doing the work. When you get in a situation where you lose 2 engines, you have all that weight, you're in a cloud situation that you lose. The 2 and 3 engines were also the engines that supplied the electricity for the airplane. They carried the generators on them. So when you lose those 2 engines, you're flying before at 7,000, 8,000 feet with 8,000 going down, and there are 7,000-foot mountains on the west coast of Japan. And you can't see them because, again, you're foggy. And the fog went down when we bailed out. It went down to about 1,000 feet above ground. So that I'm a coward. When I was young, I didn't like to look over heights. But when Harry Asherfield, the pilot, said, "Let's go," the first one that went out was the bombardier. The second one that went out was the navigator. The third one that went out was the radio man. This is from the front. They're bailing out from the back. The fourth one that went out was me. The next one was the co-pilot, and the last one was the pilot. And I was petrified. But I bailed out because again, when you're in the service and you're that young, you don't argue with orders. I mean, it says jump, jump. And I had a friend of mine who told me about another one. He had to bail out of a plane, 29, and someone refused to do it, and they just went down with the plane, and it was terrible. I liked the service. I was single. I saw England. I saw Germany. I saw Germany when I went in 46 and 47. We went to Germany, to Würzburg, Germany, which had been bombed by us, and they had cleaned the bricks off the street and put them on the sidewalks. That was still like Germany. If you were walking down the street in town and you were smoking, which I did then, and you took a cigarette and you go like this, it never hit the ground because there were kids following you, fighting to get that cigarette because they could take the cigarette and take it to a cigarette maker and get some money. And the cigarette maker would use that tobacco to make new cigarettes that he would sell to somebody else. So England in 48 still had rationing. And I saw a lot. I saw the world. I saw Okinawa in 48. I saw Newfoundland about 3 times in 48. Alaska, So it was a good thing for me. And when Korea started, the day before Korea started, where the planes were kept, at 5 o'clock, everybody went home and the planes were there. The day after Korea, I was supposed to go out and fly, and I started out to go to my plane, and I got stopped 3 times by young kids. I was 20 years old at that time. I was old. By young recruits carrying guns who wouldn't let me go near the airplane. They had that whole thing knocked down. It was just a difference between, well, when the last war we got into, when 9/11 came along, I'm sure a lot of the bases were like that, and then they just went locked down. And this is what happened at Spokane, Washington. We had, before, 2 months before Korea, we were scheduled, the 98th Bomb Group was going to be stationed in Puerto Rico. It was going to be transferred there. I had re-enlisted for 3 years, and they said, well, you can't go because you won't have enough time there. I was working as a mechanic at that time in the 29th. And I said, well, no, I was flying engineer. And I said, well, I want to go to Puerto Rico. What can I do? They said, well, you can re-enlist. You could extend your enlistment for a year. I said, fine, that sounds good. So I extended my enlistment for a year. At that point in time, Korea started. Harry Truman took my extension away and extended my enlistment because the United States of America wanted me to extend it, not because I wanted to extend it. The 92nd Bomb Group goes to Yokota ahead of us. We take off and go to Yokota. When we land in Yokota, on this hangar, that will hold the 29, there's this big sign, "Welcome to Puerto Rico." So they had their joke. And, I don't know. It's hard. I just always felt sorry for those poor bastards on the ground. They had tough fight. After I left, the MiGs came in, and the 29 quit being a daytime bomber. They knocked down a number of them, which 29 was a good plane, but it wasn't made to fight against jets. The service at that time in Korea, we were young. I gotta say this. This is Korea. We were in Japanese barracks, and we would bring in a case of beer and drink the beer, and they had Japanese people coming in to clean the barracks, and just put the beer cans over here. And we got a new adjutant for Lieutenant Colonel Joe White, Tiger Joe, who is the group base commander, who was the squadron commander of 343rd. Anyway, this new adjutant comes in, and I could tell you all sorts of stories like this, but this I'll tell you. He comes in, he says, looks at the beer in there, he says, there shall be no beer drinking in this barracks anymore. You will not have any bottles of beer. If you're going to drink, you go over to the base club, et cetera, et cetera. So no more beer in the barracks. Now Tiger Joe comes in, he's wearing his pinks, the old Army pinks. And what happens, something happened that he got a rip in him. Now, at the end of the barracks, there was a Japanese tailor. So what Tiger Joe does is he goes into the entryway And over just off the entryway across this thing is a room where 6 master sergeants slept. So what he does is he goes in there, he takes his pants off. The room's vacant. Takes his pants off, gets someone to take the pants down to the tailor. And since he's standing there and he's got no pants on, he says, well, I'll just have a drink. Now, he knows the master sergeants. They're not supposed to have any drinks in the barracks. But behind the wall, they had set up a liquor establishment. And so he goes over and he pulls the wall down because he knows where this is at. And he's standing there pouring himself a drink when the adjutant comes in. Now, you got to realize the adjutant's the first lieutenant, and he's the lieutenant colonel, standing there with no pants on, with his coat on, pouring a drink. That night, that afternoon, there went a thing out. Now you can drink beer in the barracks as long as you throw your bottles, not cans, bottles, into the trash cans, which are going to be supplied to every part of the barracks. And it's crazy. It was crazy. Things happen. But Korea was just hell. And the first year was hell. The first year, if you look at the figures, that's when the poor people on the ground. We have at the 272 Korean war vets have people that were at Chosun Reservoir. I hope they get a chance to talk to them. Bruce McDonald and other ones. Because they have, when you're down on the ground, it's entirely different than flying over in the air. Especially since we didn't, at the time that I was there, have the MiGs coming down. And the MiGs and the U.S. jets. Yeah. I don't know what it, I'm searching my mind at the things that I remember are crazy things that I've never been on a horse before. After we bailed out, they sent us on a 7 days R&R at this Japanese hotel. And so we go there and we walk into town, this little town, and we're walking around and we start walking back. And this Japanese gentleman comes up with a horse and asks if anybody ride a horse. I have never been on a horse. I came out of St. Louis in the Depression. I mean, you didn't have money to ride a horse. So I said, yeah, I'll do it. And whatever the money was, I had the yen. And I gave it to him, and I got on the horse, and he gave me the reins, and he had another thing he was walking. And all of a sudden, the horse smelled its home and took off running in this little Japanese town with very narrow streets. And I'm sitting up on top of this thing trying to control the horse. And he went right up to it had a little stable right next to the house, went up to the stable and stopped, and I got off. And he says, came running up. He says, oh, you can get on again, get on again. And never. I walked back. I'd never been on a horse since my life. It's just weird, Things like that.
So you jumped out of a plane a week before and then had the horse experience all in one eventful week. Yeah,
it was. And the thing was, there were things like that happened to you in a lifetime. I had 5.5 years in the service, and it was at a point in time when the service was trying to get over a war that had killed 500,000 men. I am a great believer that God has taken care of me in my lifetime. I was a mechanic on a plane numbered 667. It's the only plane that I have ever remembered in number. And I worked on that plane for 6 months, and I did a good job. And the crew chief left, and this was in 1948, early in 48. And I wanted to become the crew chief. And because I think, maybe rightly so, they felt they didn't have enough experience, they put another person in, and then they thought, well, I had said I wanted to be crew chief. Well, maybe there'll be some hard feelings, etc. And they transferred me over to another plane. In 48, we went to Okinawa. We went into Barbers Point, which is a naval air station in Oahu, very close to Honolulu. We stayed the night. We got up the next morning, had beans for breakfast, because that's what the Navy had for breakfast. Went out to the flight line to get on a plane, and 667 took off with Sala and other people I worked with. Took off, lost an engine, didn't get any height at all, turned around and crashed, and everybody got killed. If I had become the crew chief, I'd be dead. I wouldn't be talking to you. You know. And Sala was from Texas. He was like 7th generation American. His family came up from Mexico, but he had been in Texas since the beginning of the state, and became a state before when the Texas Revolution started. His family fought for on the American side, and we were good friends. And he had stayed on the plane. I got off. It seemed like every time we went someplace, we lost the plane. When I got out of the service, I got out in 51. In January of 53, I started college at St. Louis University. I graduated in the summer of 56. One reason I could do that was because you didn't have to take any athletics at all if you were military, coming from the military. I had a fellowship with the Ford Foundation, doing a study on St. Louis government, politics, voting, etc., from the fall of 56 through 57, at the end to 57, 58, fall of that year. And then I went to work for the city of St. Louis in the building division. Got married in 60, was going to go to law school, and then our first child was born in 61, and I was going to go to law school. Our second was born in 62. I was going to go to law school, and our third was born in 63, and I said, oh, the heck with it, I'm not going to try it anymore. So we've been married. I had 2 more children after that, and one born in 66 and 70. 4 girls and 1 boy. We've been married for 54 years now. And we have 7 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. And as I say, I'm a Catholic. We have practiced our faith. Thank God for my wife, because otherwise I had probably been dead about 30 years ago. So, but I still like the service. I have a son who lives in Virginia, who spent 26 years in the Navy. I say this, and I truly believe it, and I'll finish. I truly believe that everyone who is enlisted or been drafted and served their country well with whatever they were doing is a hero. And the reason I say this is you are a hero based upon circumstances. Audie Murphy, who received the Congressional Medal of Honor during the Second World War, if he would have maybe walked through that enlist where he was doing the getting him ready to be assigned, if he would have maybe been a day early or a day late, he could have been a cook up at Spokane, Washington. That's what they needed at that time, and they assign you. I was a mechanic. And I was a good mechanic. And I came back from Okinawa, and I'm laying on my bunk. And a guy comes in and says, does anybody want to go to flight engineer school in Spokane, Washington? And I say, where is it? And he says, Chanute Field. I said, where the heck is Chanute Field? He says, well, it's down in Rantoul, Illinois. And I say, well, I'll go. I'm from St. Louis. I might get home for Christmas. They needed 5 bodies to go on a C-47, get on a C-47 next morning to go to Chanute Field. And that's how they got them. Now, as a mechanic, I would not have faced any enemy. But because I went to Chanute Field, I wound up flying 43 missions over North Korea. Just like if I had not said, if that guy had come in 3-4 hours later, I probably wouldn't have been there, and I'd still be, I would have got discharged as a mechanic, and that would have still been acceptable. But it's circumstances that makes heroes. And everybody in the Army or the Navy or the Air Force or whatever is subject to being assigned into duties that put them in jeopardy. And if you're in jeopardy, you're a hero. That's what I feel.